let's make a start whilst we just wait for her to join us. So, brilliant. This webinar is really about Ruwena's journey into becoming a recorder. Forgive me, I think there we are. There she is. And not in court clothes. I'm so impressed.
Oh, good.
Yes, you probably didn't have a hearing or like
No.
and I didn't have time to change into it. So I hope we can learn some stuff. So it's all good. Let's get going. Over to you, Ruwena. Looking great. I love that shirt.
Thank you very much. I thought it's probably better than doing a suit, and it's far too hot. So I think one of the things I'm grateful for, aside from the fact that I'm grateful that I've been invited by Sally and Women in the Law UK to speak, is that people are giving up sunshine time to listen to me babble on. So I'm really grateful for all of you ladies who are watching. So thank you. In terms of talking about how I've become a DDJ, Deputy District Judge, and the path I've taken, obviously I'm happy to do questions. I know Sally wants to do questions at the end. If as we go along there's something that I say that prompts a question, I'll try and make sure I read it off the chat and deal with it. But I thought if I go through the background of what I did, and then perhaps some tips which may be useful for anyone who's thinking about either becoming a DDJ or taking some kind of tentative steps towards applying to become a member of the judiciary. So Sally, if it's all right, so you're not all just staring at my face the entire time, which won't be pleasant. I've got some slides which I can share.
Perfect. Your co-host, so go ahead.
Okay, brilliant. So if you just bear with me, because I appreciate text not my forte. Oh.
Just whilst Ruwena's doing that, if you've listened to any of the podcasts and you think they're great, please can you say so? I'd like to interview even more people. And my producer's always saying, get people to write in to say that it's great. I'm like, it's just embarrassing doing that. So if you can, that'll be great. Are you ready to?
Yeah, I am. So
perfect.
Hopefully this should work.
Yay.
Have you all got that?
Yes, perfect. I feel like we need a clap just for that because of technology.
Technology, I can manage it just about. Yeah. All right, so in terms of my general background, perhaps for those of you who are still at uni, it may assist just knowing where I went. So I was at Manchester Uni after I finished my GCSEs and A-levels in Altrincham in Cheshire.
Ah, good.
Yeah, so I did a 3-year law degree and then went to what was the Inns of Court School of Law. So I think when I focused on becoming a barrister, it was the very first year that there was more than one bar school available. So now obviously you can go to Leeds where I teach part-time, Manchester, Nottingham, there's a number of options. So I went from there to do the bar course down in London for a year and then was called to the bar in 2005. I then was very fortunate, had a couple of offers for pupillage, so went straight into pupillage at what was Zenith Chambers in Leeds and did a common law pupillage. So I did a little bit of everything. And initially, as most students who do law would attest to, I thought, right, crime, that's what I want to do. It's the more interesting and glamorous lifestyle being at the bar. I'm sure Sally would agree and understand that. Yeah.
I don't know about glamorous.
It's certainly got more interesting stories than what I ended up doing, I expect. So I did a little bit of everything, which I think actually gave me a really good grounding in terms of advocacy, written skills, some of the skills that I've been able to bring in my very short career so far at the judiciary. And from 2006 to 2020, so when I became a tenant at Zenith Chambers, I started off again with a mixed practice and then eventually specialised in PI and clinical negligence. So probably for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been practicing solely in those areas. I then joined Caroline's Chambers. I didn't realise she was attending today, so hello, Caroline. at Park Square Barristers in Leeds, so a couple of doors down from Zenith. And again, I'm continuing my specialisation in PI and clinical negligence. So that's my very brief background. I'm now a full-time barrister at PSQB. In terms of the judicial aspect of things, and I suppose the thinking behind why I wanted to apply, in terms of my practice in general, particularly with the civil work, I was doing a mixture of claimant work and defendant work, and I've maintained that. There were periods of time when I was doing perhaps predominantly claimant work. Sometimes I'd go into a phase where I was doing predominantly defendant work. But I think it really helped with my own practice, but it also helped me to start thinking about the judiciary and how I'd look at a case more objectively, in that you start seeing cases from both sides. And it came to the point, perhaps in more recent years, where I'd go into a court case or a court trial and start thinking to myself, well, I'm not sure about that judgment. That's not quite what I would have done. I'm sure those who are lawyers who were in attendance for this webinar are probably thinking the same and have thought the same for many years. When you go to a case and you see the judge has made a decision, you think that's not how I would have done it, or that's not how I would have said it. And I found that I was doing that more and more as the years went on. And I just thought, well, actually, it's not to say that I could do the job better. I wouldn't ever say, oh, I saw a judge and thought I'd be tons better. That's probably a lie. There's probably one or two judges that we all know where we think, how the hell are you even on the bench, if I'm being honest. But it's more thinking, well, my practice has got to a certain stage where I feel happier and more content that I know what I'm doing, what's the next step, and perhaps the judiciary was the next thing I was thinking about. So the application process that I went for started in 2018, I think it was. There had been an invitation for applications a couple of years before that, so I would have been perhaps 10 or 11 years call. And albeit I could have given it a go, I think I was still at that stage where I thought, I don't feel quite right going for this yet. So in 2018, so when I was 13 years into practice, I thought, okay, that's absolutely fine. Some people will apply a lot more junior. Some people will take a lot more time before they think about going into the judiciary or attempting to do it. So the next slide I've got is, you know, what I did to work out whether it was in fact the right thing to do in a practical sense. So at my chambers, we had a significant number of deputy district judges. Most chambers, most law firms will have somebody that you can go and speak to. If not within your own firm or chambers, then you may have come across somebody. So I actually found speaking to those members of chambers who are my friends and colleagues a real help, because it's not obvious at first where you go to get assistance with making an application or what the process is going to be like. So I spoke to a few of them about how they went through it, what they did. I also read up on the role of the judiciary in general terms. Websites are of great assistance, and I'll come on to one in a moment, which was particularly helpful. There's also a newsletter which the Judicial Appointments Commission provide, I think, on a monthly basis, called Judging Your Future. So you can subscribe to that, even if you're thinking about it at this stage and it may be years ahead that you would actually make the application, but do subscribe. Also, this day and age, particularly in lockdown, if you weren't on social media before, I think most people are now. The Judicial Appointments Commission are on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter. So I'd really recommend that you follow them if you're not already doing so, and read up on the links that they send out. The other thing that's possible, and for those of you who are at university, if you haven't already done it, is shadowing members of the bench. So you can do some marshalling, so you can make applications to do that, just to get a flavour of what it's like. The other thing that I found really useful for those of you that are going into court is to speak to court staff. So the ushers, the clerks, those in the court office, if you get an opportunity, they will give the best tips on what makes a good judge, what they really like to see behind the scenes, what it's like to work with a judge on a day-to-day basis. And you find out all sorts of things that they may not even be supposed to be telling you, but it is actually really handy to speak to them. So again, for those of you who are law students or thinking about coming to the bar, or those of you who go to court, just speaking to them and getting an idea of what makes a good judge is great. And I know it sounds like an odd thing perhaps to do, to ask them, but I actually found it really helpful, and that's certainly something that I did before I made the application. The best source of information, I've done a screenshot here from the Judicial Appointment Commission website, and this is from a few days ago, so clearly the news section is going to be a bit different now, but it is actually the best source of information. I can't emphasize that enough. In some respects, if you don't get to speak to people in person, particularly if you're thinking about it now and you might not be able to easily chat with anyone who's been through the process already, do go on this website. Not only does it contain all the information that you need in terms of upcoming vacancies, it's just background to what the judiciary is all about, what the judges do themselves, latest news and information. So I really would recommend that. If you go on to the, as I say, within that website, there's a whole section about the application process. And if I can do this, right. So the section here, before you apply, when you click on that page, you come up with all these different links. And these are all individually incredibly useful. So am I eligible? Eligible. Obviously, most of us, that'll be absolutely fine. There are those roles that are only for those who are legally qualified. There'll be some that are non-legally qualified candidates. It might be sitting on tribunals and so on. It's worth investigating, because it's not necessarily the case that you have to await until you've got a law degree. There may be those of you who've gone through a slightly different route into practice, or you know, you're not quite there yet in terms of your studies, so it's worth investigating. This section here, am I ready, again, is another one that's really good if you're at the stage where you're thinking about it but you're not yet quite confident in making the application. They give you some further details about what it is that the Judicial Appointments Commission are looking for in a candidate. The competency frameworks, again, I'll look at that in a moment, is of particular assistance because it breaks down exactly the criteria that the JAC are looking at. It gives you the tips to prepare for the application. It tells you more about the judicial work shadowing scheme. So if you don't have a way through your university or through your firm or chambers to work out or have the links to do marshalling, it's good to try and do it through them. Here we have case studies, and again, I'll show you a screen on that in a moment. They are of real assistance. So when I was applying, I looked, as I say, the other day to see what the current case studies are. When I was doing it, there were about 3 or 4 case studies up of people who'd just been through the process. Read those, try and understand and get a feel for what the process is going to be like, what tips they give you, because actually it's incredibly insightful. What things they found difficult, what they emphasized in the application process. And again, for me, it was just getting tips and getting as much information as I could. So the Am I Ready page, it gives you all this information. I don't propose to read through it. It's just an example of the kind of detail that the JAC have there. And they actually have some tests online that you can do. And it's not tests where they record the result and they will keep it as part of your process. It's just for those who want to give it a go. So here you can see you test yourself on eligibility. Well, that's fairly straightforward for everyone. Testing yourself on good character is just looking through their guidance as to what they require for good character, whether you meet it. Basically, as long as you've not done anything unlawful and you've got no convictions, is more or less what they require. Suitability. So what decisions would you make in situations you may face as a judge. So they'll give you some kind of scenarios to look through. So again, it's worth having a look at, just to give you a flavour of it. As you can see, they're under further information, as I've said already. They're taken anonymously, scores are not generated, they're not recorded. You could go back and do them a couple of times over if you wanted to. So as I was saying to you before, there are these case studies, and you can see there's examples for almost every type of judicial role that they have available for applications at the moment. So they've got a number of Deputy High Court Judge case studies, Deputy District Judge. Here we can see Ian Ashley Smith. I just clicked on his page by way of example. He's the most recent example of a DDJ case study. As I said, when I applied a couple of years ago, there were 3 or 4 examples which were of assistance. The competency framework. So this is quite useful to read through if you do get a chance. Almost entirely the application process is based around this competency framework, and it's going back to 2014. So it's a judicial skills and ability framework. Now, for those of you who've applied in the current process or have gone through this in a similar way for a different role, or are looking in the future to apply, it may have changed by the time you do it, but this is certainly what they've been using for the last few years. And when I applied, and there are 6 criteria that they look at in terms of assessing your application, the answers that you give in interview, your mock trials, and so on. So assimilating and clarifying information. Effectively, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you can take on heaps of information in one go. And I think any of us who have practiced in law for any period of time, no matter what type of practice area it is, will all say, yeah, we are more than used to. It doesn't mean we like it, but we're more than used to going through caseloads that are way too much in paperwork, that they're in a mess, and we've somehow got to review everything and take in all the information. So the first part of the competency framework should be quite straightforward for most lawyers. 2, working with others as solicitors, those of you who are working in law firms. Again, that should hopefully be no problem. For those of us who are at the bar, depending on how involved you get in chambers life and doing other things, it might be a bit more difficult potentially to provide examples on working with others. But it's really thinking back on what you've done in the past as a good example of how you communicate. Exercising judgment, an obvious one. Possessing and building knowledge. So what they mean by that, and this is something that I didn't necessarily realise until I spoke to a previous DDJ at my chambers, is what they mean is effectively continuing professional development, but what you have done outside of the bounds of what you're required to do to try and build up your own practice. So, for example, I put as part of my application form that I'd go down to conferences in London that were about traumatic brain injury, neuropsychiatry, things like that, that didn't fall as part of my circuits, webinars or sessions, but it's something that I found myself that I wanted to assist with my own learning. So most of you will, for example, even attending these Zoom sessions and Sally's webinars, it's a great thing to say. It's ways of building up your own knowledge. It's a great example to give. 5, managing work efficiently and communicating effectively. Again, obvious things that we need to be able to demonstrate as part of the application process. So I keep going on about the application process. What was it? So for me, when I did it in my year, obviously we had the application form itself. Now, one of the things I was given significant warnings about is how long it takes. And it's absolutely right. It will take you at least a full day of doing nothing but the application form, or a couple of days, a good few hours every day. So give yourself plenty of time before you do that application form. It looks like it's quite easy in some senses. You've got about 5 or 6 boxes that you need to complete, where all you are really saying is, or giving examples rather of each of those competency frameworks or something similar. Give us an example of when you demonstrated independence, was one on my application form. as I say, the box, it looks quite simple, but what you need to do is then look back at cases or something that you've done that perhaps goes outside the norm of your day-to-day practice to demonstrate independence, or how you've had to deal sensitively with somebody. So I'm happy to share with the one example I gave, for example, in the question with dealing with something sensitively. One of my cases a few years back, so you have to go back in your career history sometimes to think of these things, was a lady, young Asian Muslim, and she'd suffered an injury at work, quite significant injury, and it affected her her groin area, and it was for her very embarrassing to discuss. And we had a white male solicitor in the conference. Now, most of us would, you know, if you're not seeing effectively or not letting it affect you in any way, shape or form, skin tone, race, religion, it doesn't bother you. But for her, she was very, very sensitive to the fact that, one, there was a male there, two, someone who might not understand her ethnic or cultural or religious background. So we had to deal with that in a particular way. I had to sort of explain to him, take him aside as to why she was having difficulty, speak to her about what the process was. So it is a case of, for the application, trying to find some unusual examples of how you have demonstrated these key competencies. The other thing that you'll need, of course, is your references, which for everyone should be easy enough to gain. If you're in chambers, it will ordinarily be your head of chambers and somebody else. It's quite useful if you do have a link to somebody at the judiciary. And what I mean by a link, I don't mean in any by way of nepotism or anything like that. But for example, I had someone from my chambers became a full-time DJ. He was a friend and a colleague, so he was one of my references. But anyone who's got experience, who knows you, who can demonstrate that you've got integrity and good ability, knows your work, that will be sufficient. So once you've gone through the application process, you then have an online test to complete, and it does take several hours. So clearly Wi-Fi and all of that needs to be sorted. You need somewhere quiet. The first section is pretty much multiple choice, what you would do in a judicial situation or scenario, and they'll give you 4 different responses and you have to choose them, the one that you think is most appropriate. The second part of the test that we had was reading a passage and then effectively choosing the correct answer for a question about the passage, which was quite surprisingly straightforward. And then the third part of the test was effectively giving 2 very short written judgments, which were civil judgments in my case. So that again was all right if you're used to doing written opinions and so on. If you get through the application process in terms of the application form and then the online test, you have your call to the final stage of the process, which is a day of mock hearings and an interview panel. So we had actors and actresses who came in and were counsel or solicitor advocates, witnesses. You had people who were crying, people who were yelling. You could hear arguments coming down the corridor before they entered into the room where you're sitting there as the judge. And what they do is try and see how you deal with any given scenario in a 20-minute session. So I think we had 2 20-minute sessions. And you're put in a room to start with for about half an hour or an hour, where they'll give you a case summary, and that's probably the extent of what they give you. And then they see how you deal with the case on the day. So there'll be a number of things that they'll give you within that 20 minutes, just to see how you manage your time. And that's one of the key things that they look at. Once you've gone through those mock trials, and you try and make sure you get you're calm again, and you can deal with it. You're then put in front of, I think it was 3 members of a panel. One will be a lawyer, one independent, one from the Judicial Appointments Commission. And I'll be honest, it was quite tough. They will ask you questions on your application form, and on top of the examples that you provide on your application form about how you've demonstrated integrity, independence, and so on, they will expect you to have in your pocket some additional examples. So I will emphasize that in the interview. Be prepared to give further examples than what you've said in your application form already. Sorry, let me get this working. I would go to the next slide, but it keeps moving. There we go. So the current test, which they've adjusted for the current COVID circumstances, is a combined qualifying test. Now, I don't know whether they intend to keep this for future years for anyone who's qualifying, whether as a DDJ or any other role that you decide to go for. So we see there the fee paid tribunal, employment tribunal, also it's the test that they're currently doing. So rather than doing the application first, the application form as I did in my year, they're allowing you to do the online test first. And if you get through the online test, you then provide an application form. And then if you get through those, so they've kind of done it the other way around, you'll be called for a selection day, which at the moment is not until the beginning of next year. So the combined qualifying test at the moment is a situational judgment test and a critical analysis test. It doesn't seem that they've done a third part of the test, which we had to do online, which was writing a judgment, but that may well change in future years. So, as I say there at the start, it actually took about a year from when I first put in the application to them actually telling us that we'd got through. So I think the application form went in about March 2018, I think it was. And then they effectively formally announced it at the beginning of 2019 and appointed the DDJs for that year. And what you need to do once you then get appointed is you've got 5 days of residential training, and they're very full on 5 days, 4 nights, 5 days down at Warwick University, where they will send you all the reading materials in advance. And they say that the reading takes about 60 hours. That is not an underestimate. That's quite accurate. They sent us about 800 pages of reading to do in advance for this 5-day residential training course. And then when you go to the course, the day will be split up into sessions with your key group, who will be a group of about 6 or 7 of you from all across the country, different backgrounds, which is great because you really do get to learn a lot from everybody. You'll do some classes with them, and then you'll be split up into different groups with other new people for the day, and they'll effectively just teach you the basics in every area of law that you need to deal with in order to carry out your role. So, for example, we did a mixture of PI for the basic civil, but we also did commercial litigation, debt, housing, and so on. So that it was very full on. You'll be glad to know as well, for those who are wondering how it's possible to take 5 days off work, they are 5 paid days. So the judicial office will pay you for those 5 days that you are taking away from your normal day job. The other requirement is that you spend 5 days shadowing. So what they will do is they'll appoint you to a particular circuit. So I'm on the Northeastern Circuit, and they'll appoint you within your circuit to a particular cluster. So I've got South Yorkshire, which means Sheffield, Doncaster, Hull, so the Humber as well, so Hull and Grimsby. There'll be those who are in Central and West who'll get Leeds, for example. Northwest will cover Manchester, etc. You will be expected to move around different clusters, but primarily the intention is to keep you sitting within your particular area. And they'll make sure that you shadow 5 judges over 5 days in that particular cluster. And effectively what you do is you just sit behind them for the day and just learn from them, ask them as many questions as you can, and just see what they do day to day and how the admin works. So once you've done all of that, as I say, you get let loose on the public, which is terrifying. I know Sally has done webinars, and also I attended one of the Women in the Law UK conference in Manchester, one of the issues that so many of us have, me definitely included, is imposter syndrome. And you sit there on your first day and think, I'll be really honest, I just thought, oh my God, they're now coming to me thinking I know all the answers. And it is quite terrifying, as exciting as it is as well. But you get into the swing of it. The thing to remember when you're sitting as a new member of the judiciary is that you can always stop a hearing. So for those of us who practice and have gone into court hearings, when the judge says, I'm going to stand the matter down for a while, it's not necessarily to help you out. It may well be that they need to look something up, or they go and speak to colleagues. So it's quite useful. All the judges that I had and the mentor that you get allocated kept reminding me, don't panic. You can go and ask for help. So you have 3 days sitting before you then have your first appraisal. You then have a second appraisal within approximately 6 months or so. The lists, particularly in civil law, are mentally busy. You've just got to manage them as best as possible. The court staff are brilliant. They really hold your day in their hands, so it's best to just remember that. They tend generally to get on with absolutely everyone, but if they don't like an individual who's been rude, not saying that anyone ever would who's watching this, but you know, they remember that. So it's always worth bearing that in mind. Judicial office, I've put that down in that list on the slide, just so I remind myself to let you know, the judicial office are the ones who book your day. They'll give you lists in advance for you to book days that you're available from your normal practice to be able to sit. And you're normally expected to sit at least 35 days as a very bare minimum every year. And as I've said, that it's an incredibly steep learning curve. It truly is. You get thrown in at the deep end, but absolutely everybody is willing to help. And that's one of the things I was concerned about. And those of you who are thinking about it may be concerned about is it going to be a lonely job? And having been in chambers where everyone is incredibly friendly and really collegiate, I just thought, I'm going to be on my own. I'll have no one to talk to, no one to give guidance, and it's not like that at all. Every single court that I've sat in has been really helpful, very friendly. The judges are incredibly nice. You do get to see a completely different side to them when you're sat on the other side of the bench than what you see day to day. Yeah, no, absolutely loving it. And I would highly recommend anyone who is thinking about it to just give it a go. I am aware of a good number of people who give it a go may not succeed on the first try. They try a number of times again. I know someone who tried 3 times, bless them, that they've managed to get through this year. So if you're determined, I absolutely recommend it. I'm more than happy to ever answer any queries beyond this webinar. If there's anyone who wants to ask any question, or if I can assist in any way, I happily will do. But yeah, questions. So Sally, I think I'm back to you now, aren't I?
Well, fantastic. Yeah. So let's start by doing what we normally do on here for our speakers. Look, Nikki's straight there. That was really, really great, thorough, from beginning to end, and fantastic.